Get ready to rumble. Schilling Show Unleashed on the Seven Thunders Media Network. Former city councilor, husband, father, and community watchdog. Your host, Rob Schilling.
Welcome to the Schilling Show Unleashed Podcast. Remember, your direct support makes our show possible, and you can directly support this podcast by visiting shillingshow.com and then clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page to make a monthly contribution. We appreciate your support. The Schilling Show Unleashed Podcast welcomes Bonner Cohen, Ph.D., a senior fellow at the National Center for Public Policy Research, a senior policy advisor at the Heartland Institute, and so much more. We're talking today about climate truths and climate hoaxes. And Dr. Cohen, thank you for joining us on the Schilling Show Unleashed.
Well, Rob, thank you very much for having me.
I'd like to go first to the state of my birth and where I lived for a good portion of my life, California. They're doing something crazy again. And I'd like to talk about the freight, rail, and the supply chain, California's net zero emissions rule. Tell us about this mandate that only California could come up with.
You're quite right about the origin of it. Yes, California will always be California. Last year, the California authorities instituted a rule mandating that all locomotives operating in California, whether long-haul carriers or short-haul passenger freight, no matter, all locomotives must be zero emissions locomotives by the year 2030. That means that those locomotives, which today are powered by diesel, will have to switch to something that will be deemed by the California Air Resources Board, CARB, as meeting their requirements. The problem here, and actually there are many problems here, but the big problem here is that these zero emissions locomotives do not exist, and in all likelihood are not going to exist by the arbitrarily set deadline of 2030. Now, it would be comforting to say, okay, that's just California being California. It's not going to affect us. Well, I'm afraid it will. Why? Because owing to a tweak that's in the Clean Air Act, regulations imposed in California can be adopted by other states if they so choose, provided the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency signs off on that. And herein lies the big threat to our freight rail network. If other states adopt the California zero emissions locomotive rule, and the candidates would be the usual suspects: New York, Massachusetts, New Jersey, Illinois, Washington, Oregon. I think we could pretty well figure out who that is. Then you will have some states requiring zero emissions locomotives. Other states will not. And what that could lead to is a patchwork of different requirements for locomotives throughout the United States. And one of the things that we have in this country that has worked really so well is our freight rail network, which carries 40% of all the goods that are distributed around the country. If you throw a monkey wrench into that in the name of combating climate change, you will disrupt that network. You will create bottlenecks, the likes of which will far exceed anything we experienced during COVID. And you could just imagine you have a zero emissions locomotives, never mind it doesn't exist now. It leaves California, goes into Nevada, which has no such requirement. What's it then supposed to do? Switch to diesel, go on to another state, say Illinois, that then requires zero emissions locomotives. You get the idea. It is going to be complete chaos. Another element to this is where in the world are these zero emissions locomotives, essentially electric locomotives, where and how are they going to be recharged? We're already seeing with the government-driven effort to force-feed the American public electric vehicles, EVs, that we simply don't have the charging stations to cover that need. Throw locomotives into the mix, and you are leading to something that will be completely chaotic. Another interesting thing is, yes, we do have electric locomotives that carry passengers on Amtrak's northeastern network from Washington up to Boston, but those are passenger trains. They're shorter, they're lighter. The electric locomotives have no problem carrying them. But freight trains can be up to a mile long and carry loads that far exceed anything a passenger train could do. In other words, we're mandating a technology that does not exist. And we are doing this in the name of combating climate change. And the Biden EPA has just signed off on this, giving a green light for any other state that so chooses to follow in California's footsteps and create bottlenecks, again, the likes of which we have never seen before.
Dr. Cohen, one of the things that troubles me, and I want to allude to something you just said, which was the lack of ability to carry freight. We've seen it with the electric pickup trucks. As soon as you attach a trailer and start towing, it drops their range by about 50%. And the second issue is dealing with the cold, which also drops range. So have they discussed any of those problems?
No. That rarely ever, if at all, entered into their calculations. They are so fixated on lowering emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, in the name of combating man-made climate change, that very important details, such as the ones that you just brought up, fell under the table. That is not being considered, even though it's a very obvious question. Take an 18-wheeler truck currently powered by diesel. If the truck of the same size, powered by electricity with a battery inside, is going to weigh so much more than its diesel counterpart, because EV batteries are very heavy, that the truck will have a smaller carrying capacity because so much space is taken up by the battery. Well, the same thing will happen with freight trains. If you have this currently completely hypothetical zero emissions locomotive pulling a freight train, again, there will be a gigantic battery or batteries powering the things that will weigh so much that the freight trains themselves will have reduced capacity, which means that you'll have to have more freight trains rambling through the network, which will cost more money, the costs of which are going to be passed on to people who go to grocery stores and hardware stores and wherever they go to buy goods, because those goods are going to be more expensive.
I have also heard, and you could probably confirm this, Dr. Cohen, that they are proposing the same for trucks, that all of the long-haul diesel trucks need to be replaced with electric vehicles in California sometime soon.
Not just in California. That's actually something that the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, wants to impose nationwide. And again, you're mandating the use of a technology that is going to do an enormous amount of harm, because these trucks are going to be very heavy. They're not going to be able to carry nearly the amount of goods that current trucks can do. And owing to their very heavy weight, they are going to wreak havoc to roads and bridges because they're going to tear them up. And by the way, these are not zero emissions vehicles at all. No, there's nothing coming through the tailpipe, But the tires that are used for these things are much larger. They have to be because they're carrying a heavier weight than the tires that are currently in use. And those tires are going to put emissions of particulate matter into the air. This is potentially rather dangerous stuff that you don't want rolling through your community, because it's going to greatly impair air quality. So, in something that is done in the name of environmental policy to improve the environment, that is, combat climate change, is actually going to make air dirtier.
We should also mention that in addition to the tires and what's coming off of them, that the production of the energy, the electricity required, is not at all going to be zero emission.
Not at all. The dirty little secret in all of this is that there's nothing green about green energy. On the contrary, the raw materials that go into batteries, whether those batteries are used to power trucks, currently non-existent electric locomotives, the raw material, as well as the batteries that are used with storage in facilities powered by wind and solar, but you need these backup batteries when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow. You need those raw materials for that, but you also need them to go into wind turbines and solar panels. Those raw materials are currently largely controlled by the People's Republic of China, which has an iron grip on the supply chain of all of those things. Extracting those raw materials done by mining in China itself, but quite a bit of it is done in Central Africa by children, incidentally, and younger people under absolutely appalling conditions. The amount of raw materials that have to be extracted and then processed before they ever make their way into a wind turbine or a solar panel or a battery or wherever it is that they're going. Those things have their own enormous environmental cost and are currently wreaking havoc in places like Indonesia, the aforementioned Central Africa, China, and anywhere they are extracted, because the demand for these things will be absolutely enormous.
So, Dr. Cohen, you mentioned that the EPA has already approved this proposal, but where do we go from here? Is it going to take a court case to challenge the EPA's administrative authority?
Exactly. A whole bunch of people who are directly affected by this, and that includes the freight rail operators, the agricultural sector, the manufacturing sector, anybody who is in one way or another dependent on their livelihood, any industry dependent on its livelihood, on a well-functioning freight rail system, is going to be affected by this. And believe me, those lawsuits will come, and they will come massively. There are all sorts of very arcane laws that pertain solely to freight rail transportation. There is also a landmark Supreme Court decision that was handed down 2 years ago that said that EPA cannot simply make its powers up out of thin air. It must have direct congressional authorization to undertake certain regulatory activities that will have a major impact on U.S. economy and society. This is called the Major Questions Doctrine. Now, nowhere does EPA have the authority to cripple our freight rail system. So that will be one of the other cases that will be brought against the Environmental Protection Agency.
The Schilling Show Unleashed podcast continues with our guest, Dr. Bonner Cohen, in just a moment.
Schilling Show Unleashed.
ShillingShowMedia.com is your one-stop shop for websites, audio and video production, and photography.
ShillingShowMedia.com will take your project from conception to completion.
ShillingShowMedia.com is reasonably priced and highly professional.
Need a website for your business? Visit ShillingShowMedia.com.
Need a video created or edited? Visit ShillingShowMedia.com.
Have a photography or graphic design project? Visit ShillingShowMedia.com.
ShillingShowMedia.com is your one-stop shop for websites, audio and video production, and photography.
Visit ShillingShowMedia.com. That's ShillingShowMedia.com.
Looking out for us. Rob Show.
We return now with Dr. Bonner Cohen. We're talking about climate truths and climate hoaxes. And since we're talking about vehicles, let's go to the EV mandate, a disaster for the United States, but a gift to China. A lot of people don't realize this. Tell us a little bit about how China is going to benefit from EV mandates in the U.S.
Well, as we just discussed, the batteries that would power locomotives and trucks are also going to power electric vehicles. Those batteries contain raw materials, and China has a chokehold on the supply chain of raw materials. Estimates range from 80 to 90%, and in some cases even above 90% for all of that. What this means is this transition being forced by the Biden administration and by numerous state governments, including the ones in California, are actually strengthening both the economic and the geopolitical position of China. They are doing so by making us reliant on China for the raw materials that will power our personal transportation system, and if the EPA gets its way, our freight rail system and other parts of our transportation system. Now, why in the world would we adopt policies that strengthen our greatest geostrategic rival? The Chinese are absolutely delighted to produce as many solar panels, as many wind turbines, and to supply the materials that go into those as well as in electric batteries, because they're the ones who are going to profit from the mandates that are being imposed on our transportation system, EVs and the like. So they are absolutely on board with this. It also, incidentally, turns out that China, owing to certain geological reasons, doesn't have very much oil and natural gas on its own, but it does have a lot of coal, and it burns that coal like crazy. So these solar panels and wind turbines and batteries are manufactured in facilities that are powered by coal. So here in the U.S., we shut our coal-fired power plants in the name of combating climate change, while in China, you see coal-fired power plants proliferate like crazy. By the way, they're not nearly as clean as what we have here in the U.S., all to make green energy, again showing that there's absolutely nothing green about green energy, not to mention that we simply, in the U.S., do not have and will not have anytime in the future an adequate infrastructure, a recharging infrastructure to accommodate all the EVs that we are being force-fed. How well is the government handling this? A bill was passed in Congress 2 years ago as part of the so-called Inflation Reduction Act that set aside $7.5 billion to put up 500,000 taxpayer-funded EV charging stations around the country. That was 2 years ago. And how many charging stations have gone up in the U.S. as a result of that bill passed 2 years ago? Answer, 7. So someone has calculated that at that rate, it will take about 35,000 years for this network to come into place. But that's government policy at its absolutely worst, and actually nobody should be surprised at that.
Dr. Cohen, you mentioned the problem of the charging infrastructure, which leads to related problems with EVs. One of them is range anxiety, because even if you have the chargers, the range is not so far. Also, there are costs for purchase and repair, which are extraordinary, including the fact that many of these cars are totaled even with the slightest accident.
Oh, that's right. For instance, Hertz decided it would go out and do some climate virtue signaling a couple of years ago, and it purchased a bunch of electric vehicles. They are now dumping 20,000 of those things simply because the repair costs are astronomical. Once you buy these things, they break down fairly quickly. And those repair costs are enormous. They're enormous not just, of course, to Hertz, but also to individuals who purchase these things. And remember, once those vehicles, the batteries in those vehicles wear out, the vehicle is absolutely useless. You have to dump it and you have to get another one, which brings up another environmental problem. What is to be done with the batteries in electric vehicles, or for that matter, the batteries that provide a backup for wind and solar once they die, as all batteries do? Well, they're going to have to be dumped someplace. And you'll be talking here about dumping millions and millions of batteries around the country, that with only so many landfills that we have. These things contain toxic chemicals that could, under certain circumstances, easily leach into groundwater and do other environmental harm. So again, you have the great irony. In the name of protecting the environment, in this case from climate change, we're actually threatening to do an enormous amount of environmental harm.
There is a report, and we've heard increasing reports about the costs of EVs sold, particularly within the last couple of days. There was a report from Ford losing between $65,000 and $130,000 on every EV they sell. This is a losing plan.
It is, and it's not sustainable. Where I'm afraid we're headed is that the Detroit Three, this is Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis, the maker of Jeep. These companies are being forced by the Biden administration to produce EVs for which there is a woefully inadequate market, which means that they're losing money on those EVs while at the same time being forced to phase out the gasoline-powered vehicles, which are actually still selling very well and which the public wants. What we're headed for, I'm afraid, are two things. One, if we keep going down this path, we're going to have a shortage of gasoline-powered vehicles that people really want, and we may wind up with a big pile up of electric vehicles that people do not want because they can't afford them, either to buy them outright, much less operate them once they have been purchased. Where will all of that lead? Well, be prepared as a U.S. taxpayer to bail the big three. Now, we would call them probably more accurately simply the Detroit Three, but bail them out as we have had to bail them out before. Sadly, we have made our domestic automobile manufacturers appendages of the federal government. They may be on paper independent companies operating in what we are told is a free market, but the market is not free if the government is forcing consumers to buy X as opposed to buying Y. That is a recipe for disaster for the automobile industry, as well as for the tens of thousands of workers involved therein who stand to lose their jobs.
I think, Dr. Cohen, about Cuba, where they're still nursing 1950s era Chevrolets. We've seen the pictures before because they just can't get anything newer. Are we heading in that direction?
I'm afraid we are. If we continue down this road and people hold on to their 2024 gasoline-powered SUV, it will, in a decade or so, become the equivalent of a 1956 Mercury still driving around the streets of Havana because poor devils who live in Cuba don't have any alternatives, which is, of course, exactly what the government down there wants, just as if there are elements within the environmental community here which are very well represented in the Biden administration, whose ultimate goal is to force people out of individual transportation, where you decide where and when you want to drive your vehicle, and you will be forced to follow the timetable of what the government wants you to do with respect to how and when you buy groceries for your families, take your kids to school, and what have you. They are making these choices for us because they, in their infinite hubris, know better. They know what's better for all of us, but as the data start to come in and people realize where all of this is heading, we can see that we are actually being guided by people who have not given sufficient thought to this, who are driven by a climate obsession, and that obsession is going to wreak havoc throughout not just U.S. society, but societies around the world, and it's in fact already doing so.
Interestingly enough, Dr. Cohen, several of the car makers who announced almost immediately that they were going all electric by 2030 have gotten off the bandwagon. They've restarted the development of their ICE engine divisions and appear to be going in a different direction. Do we expect to see that broadly?
I think we will certainly see these companies attempt to do that because they know that they're losing money on their EVs, and they know that the public, the driving public, still has a healthy appetite for gasoline-powered vehicles. So if they can get around the government mandates, which they might be able to do through the various lawsuits that have been filed against the U.S. EPA, challenging the mandates that they are putting out on EVs, be they automobiles or heavy trucks or what have you, they can hope to do that. On the other hand, if those cases are not won, they may find themselves stuck with having to produce vehicles they know the public doesn't want and phase out vehicles that they do. So yes, I anticipate them trying to do this because frankly, they don't have any choice. The losses that you cited that Ford Motor Company is enduring with every sale of an EV and tens of thousands of dollars being lost on every sale, that's not sustainable. That cannot go on. That has to end.
Finally, Dr. Cohen, what's the position of the EU in all of this? Because they seem to be heavy on the mandates. Are they backing off? Is there pressure there?
There is a lot of pressure there, too. They see, and this is a very interesting element in all of this, as you know, Europe has been a major producer of gasoline-powered vehicles, just particularly Germany. Think Mercedes, think Volkswagen, large automobile companies like that. And what they're seeing is that the country that's going to take advantage of this because it can produce EVs so much cheaper than Europeans ever could is, of course, China. And what they have done is they have taken a giant step toward deindustrialization because the policies, the climate policies, the pro-EV policies being imposed by the European Union are benefiting whom? Well, they're benefiting China. They pose a serious threat to their own automobile industry. So yes, this is having a very detrimental effect in Europe, which is already suffering through astronomical energy prices. We may gripe about what we have to pay for utility bills here. Be glad you don't live in Germany or Britain or any place else because they are so dependent on unreliable and unaffordable renewable energy coming primarily from wind and solar that their prices are astronomical, and that also makes their industries less competitive worldwide. So all of these practices, along with mandates for farmers, imposed by the EU, saying that certain methane emissions and other emissions are also causing climate change, so they're imposing rules on farmers that the farmers cannot possibly adhere to if they wish to stay in business. So you have a holy mess in the making over there, too.
Dr. Cohen, you're very prolific in your output on these topics. If people would like to read the work that you produce, would you tell us the best place to do that?
Absolutely. The best place to look on this is the website of the Committee for a Constructive Tomorrow, CFACT.org. You'll find a lot of information on the subjects I've talked about this afternoon, as well as additional information on related subjects. Check it out.
I certainly hope people will, and I hope the policymakers are listening. Dr. Bonner Cohen, thank you so much for joining us today on the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast.
Rob, thank you very much for having me.
That concludes another edition of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Visit us online at schillingshow.com, where you can directly support this podcast by clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page and making a monthly donation. Your support is essential for the continuation of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Until next time,